The courthouse was no stranger to tense mornings, but that day carried an unusual weight that hung heavy in the air. The trial at hand had already drawn a crowd far larger than most. Reporters clustered outside the tall stone building, there, cameras perched like watchful eyes, waiting for the slightest development. Inside, the oak-paneled courtroom buzzed with whispers, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. On one side of the room sat the prosecution, files stacked in neat rows. Across from them, the defense leaned in close, their whispered conversations sharp and tense. Jurors filed into their seats, some adjusting their glasses, others looking sternly forward, as if already preparing for the emotional burden of what they might hear. But even among the most seasoned lawyers and hardened reporters, no one could have predicted the moment that was about to unfold. The door at the side of the courtroom opened, and a decorated police officer stepped inside. At his side walked a figure that immediately drew every eye in the room, not a person, but a large German shepherd. His thick coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the glint of a police badge fastened securely to his sturdy collar. His gait was steady, disciplined, almost regal. This was Max, one of the city's most respected K-9 officers. The room quieted, the shuffle of papers stilled, and all eyes followed as Max and his handler moved toward the front. The judge, a stern man known for his no-nonsense demeanor, raised his brow slightly, though he remained silent. He had seen unusual witnesses before medical experts, forensic scientists, even surprise character testimonies. But this was something altogether different. Max was more than a mascot for the police department. He had earned his place as a hero, credited with solving cases that would have otherwise gone cold. His presence in the courtroom that day was symbolic, but also crucial. He was being presented as living evidence, a demonstration of loyalty, discipline, and the chain of events leading to the trial. As the handler guided Max into position, whispers spread across the rows of wooden benches. "Is that the dog from the case?" Someone murmured, "He looks terrifying." Another replied in awe, "No, not terrifying." A third corrected, "Softly, majestic." At the back of the courtroom, a woman sat with her small daughter perched on her lap. The little girl was no more than 3 years old, her hair tied in a loose ponytail, her legs swinging restlessly. She had been restless since morning, tugging at her mother's sleeve and whispering questions too curious for the solemn setting they were in. Her mother had tried to keep her calm, gently shushing her each time she spoke too loudly. But the instant Max entered the courtroom, the child fell silent. Her wide brown eyes locked onto the German shepherd with an intensity far beyond her. Years, her small hand slipped from her mother's grip, rising instinctively as she pointed at the dog. Her lips parted in awe, as though she had seen something or someone she recognized. The mother quickly lowered her daughter's arm, whispering urgently, "Sit still, sweetheart. This isn't the time." But the little girl would not sit still. She wriggled on the bench, leaning forward as if the very sight of the dog pulled her closer. She tugged at her mother's sleeve again, whispering something too faint for the rest of the courtroom to hear. Meanwhile, Max's behavior shifted in a way that startled even his handler. The dog, normally disciplined and unflinching, in public, perked his ears sharply and tilted his head, his dark eyes fixed on the child in the back row. A low, almost questioning whine escaped his throat, breaking the silence of the courtroom. The handler frowned, tugging lightly on the leash. Max had never behaved this way during testimony. Not once in his career. The judge leaned forward, his gavel poised but unused. He was about to address the unusual distraction when he noticed what everyone else had. The dog's eyes were locked on the little girl, and the girl's eyes were locked on him. The mother shifted uncomfortably under the sudden weight of so many gazes. She pressed her daughter into her lap, trying to avert attention. But the girl wriggled free again, pointing directly at Max with her tiny finger. Gasps fluttered through the courtroom as the child's voice rang out, high and clear, carrying across the wooden benches. "Doggy!" she exclaimed, her tone filled not with fear, but with familiarity. Her mother's face flushed crimson. She tried to pull her daughter close, murmuring apologies, but it was too late. The moment had already captured the room. Lawyers paused mid-note. Jurors exchanged puzzled glances. Even the judge, usually unflappable, allowed the corners of his mouth to twitch downward in surprise. The child, undeterred by the sudden attention, leaned closer to her mother, her small lips brushing against her ear. The whisper was soft, but in the thick silence of the courtroom, it carried farther than anyone expected. Two small words, fragile yet powerful, fell from her lips. "My dog." The air shifted instantly. The words struck like a stone tossed into still water, sending ripples of shock through every corner of the room. The prosecutor froze, pen hovering above paper. The defense attorney lowered his glasses, staring at the child in disbelief. The bailiff stiffened, his hand instinctively brushing the baton at his side, as though preparing for something far beyond his training. But it was Max's reaction that truly stunned them all. The German shepherd's tail, once steady at his side, began to wag slowly. His ears perked higher, his entire body leaning forward. He let out another whine, this one deeper, filled with recognition. He tugged at the leash, straining against the handler's grip, his eyes never leaving the toddler's face. The handler's knuckles whitened around the leash, his voice tense as he whispered, "Easy, Max, easy." But Max did not calm. His entire being vibrated with a restless energy that no command could quiet. It was as if he had seen a ghost, but instead of fear, his body radiated joy. The judge rapped his gavel sharply, calling for order. Yet even he could not deny the peculiarity of what had just unfolded. The little girl clung to her mother, but her wide eyes never wavered. She wasn't afraid of the imposing police dog. On the contrary, she looked as though she had finally found something she had been waiting for. In that moment, the trial itself seemed to fade into the background. The focus wasn't on the defendant, the charges, or the evidence laid before the jury. It was on a small child's innocent words and a police dog's undeniable recognition. The whispers rose again. Louder now. Did she just say it's her dog? Impossible. That's a K9. But look at him, he knows her. The judge's gavel struck again, demanding silence. But the silence that followed was not the same as before. It was charged, heavy, and filled with questions no one could yet answer. And so, in a single moment, with two fragile words, a toddler had shifted the course of the trial, setting in motion a chain of events that would leave the entire courtroom in tears. The silence in the courtroom lingered like a storm cloud, charged and unpredictable. After the toddler's innocent words, "My dog," every face had turned toward her. A mixture of disbelief, curiosity, and even awe etched across the room. But no expression carried more weight than Max's, the German shepherd, at the center of it all. His entire posture had shifted, his tail swishing slowly, his dark eyes fixed on the little girl as if nothing else in the world existed. The handler tugged the leash again, whispering commands under his breath. Normally, Max would obey instantly, his training impeccable. But this time, he resisted. He planted his paws firmly, head tilted, ears twitching at the sound of the girl's small, trembling voice. He wasn't looking at the judge, or the attorneys, or even his handler. His focus was absolute, unwavering. The judge cleared his throat, tapping the gavel once. "Order, please. We will not allow distractions in this courtroom." His words carried authority, but there was a thin crack in his tone, a hesitation. That betrayed his own unsettled feelings about what he had just witnessed. The mother shifted uncomfortably, pulling her daughter into her lap. "Sweetheart, you must be quiet," she whispered urgently, her voice thick with embarrassment. She could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom pressing on her, burning with unspoken questions. But her daughter only wriggled, leaning forward, her gaze locked on Max, as though pulled by an invisible string. For a fleeting moment, the mother considered leaving the room altogether, but something inside stopped her. Maybe it was the way Max's tail wagged gently every time her daughter moved. Maybe it was the tears pricking her own eyes as she realized what her daughter had said wasn't just childish nonsense. The little girl leaned forward again, her small hand outstretched toward the dog across the room. Her lips moved, shaping words that carried clear and sharp despite her tiny voice. "Buddy," she called softly. The handler froze. The name pierced the room like a shard of glass. The mother's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding as though it would shatter her ribcage. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, not since the day their family's dog had vanished during that violent night that still haunted her. And Max responded instantly. His ears perked higher, and with a sudden whimper, he barked once, short and sharp, as though confirming what the girl had just said. He lunged slightly forward, restrained only by the leash gripped tightly in the handler's hand. The jurors shifted in their seats, some covering their mouths, others leaning forward, their eyes wide. This wasn't just a child mistaking a dog. For her own, this was recognition. Real, undeniable recognition. "Mr. Owens," the judge addressed the handler sharply. "Control your dog." "Yes, Your Honor," the handler replied, his voice strained. His knuckles were white on the leash, but even he couldn't hide the shock in his eyes. He knew Max's history better than anyone. He knew the dog had been found years ago, wandering the streets, without an owner, without a name. That was when the department had taken him in, training him into the capable officer he had become. But deep down, Owens had always wondered about Max's past. Dogs like him didn't just appear out of nowhere. Someone must have loved him once. The little girl pressed closer against her mother, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "It's Buddy. That's Buddy." Her mother tried to quiet her again, but her own tears betrayed her. She couldn't deny it anymore. The child wasn't simply imagining things. She recognized him. The same tilt of the head, the same look in his eyes. Even after years, even after she had convinced herself he was gone forever, this dog standing in front of them was the one they had lost. The prosecutor, sensing the rising tide of emotion, stepped forward. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. We cannot allow—" "Quiet," the judge interrupted, raising a hand. "I will decide what is irregular in my courtroom." His eyes flicked briefly toward the girl, then to Max, whose tail was thumping softly against the wooden floor. The judge had presided over countless trials, seen the most hardened criminals and the most tragic victims. But this moment felt different. It carried something raw, something human that no gavel could silence. The defense attorney, equally unsettled, leaned toward his client, whispering urgently. Whatever strategy they had prepared was being shaken, not by legal arguments, but by a child and a dog. The jury's attention was no longer on the prosecution or the defense. It was locked squarely on the unbreakable connection between a toddler and a German shepherd. Max whimpered again, pulling harder now, his nails scraping the polished floor as he tried to move closer. His handler shook his head, muttering under his breath, "What's gotten into you, boy?" But the answer was obvious to everyone else. Max had recognized her too. The mother finally stood, unable to sit in silence any longer. She clutched her daughter tightly, her voice breaking as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, I don't mean to cause disruption, but years ago, during a burglary, our family dog disappeared. We searched everywhere, but we never found him. My husband reported it, but there were no leads. My daughter was just a baby back then, but she grew up hearing about him, seeing pictures. She's never forgotten." A murmur swept through the courtroom, the weight of her confession hanging heavy in the air. The judge's eyes softened for a brief moment before he steeled himself again. "Mrs. Carter," he said slowly, "are you suggesting that this police K9 is the same dog your family lost?" Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe he is. And I believe my daughter recognized him before I even did." The jurors whispered among themselves, some clearly moved, others skeptical. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, realizing this was no longer just a distraction. It was a revelation that could alter the course of everything. The judge leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He had not expected this. None of them had. What was supposed to be a straightforward testimony by a police K9 had turned into a reunion years in the making. The little girl, oblivious to the weight of the moment, stretched out her hand again, her voice trembling but filled with hope. "Buddy," she called once more. This time, Max let out a long, aching whine. He lowered himself onto his haunches, ears back, tail thumping, as though waiting for permission to go to her. The handler's hands shook as he held the leash. For the first time in his career, he questioned whether restraining Max was the right thing to do. The judge's gavel struck lightly, not to silence, but to acknowledge what everyone already knew. Something extraordinary was unfolding. No longer was this just a courtroom. No longer was this just a trial. It had become the stage for a truth that no one could deny. An innocent child had recognized her long-lost dog, and the dog had recognized her too. And in that moment, the weight of justice itself seemed to shift, hanging in the balance of a bond that no years, no training, and no circumstances could break. The murmur that spread across the courtroom after the child's soft declaration, "My dog," had not faded. It lingered, growing into a low buzz of disbelief and emotion. The judge's gavel had struck, calling for silence, but no one could truly quiet the storm that had been set loose inside those four walls. Jurors shifted, uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier composure faltering. One man rubbed the bridge of his nose. Another leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, staring openly at the little girl as though searching for answers. The defense attorney scribbled something furiously in his notes, then tore the page out and crumpled it in frustration, and the prosecution, confident only moments earlier, sat frozen. Their strongest symbol of loyalty and law, the police K9 Max, was now at the center of a deeply human story that no one had expected. Max himself seemed to have forgotten his training. His handler, Officer Owens, had been working with him for nearly 4 years. He had never seen him break discipline so completely. Max's tail thumped with restrained joy, his eyes shining not with the blank focus of a service dog, but with the spark of recognition. "Easy, Max. Stay," Owens whispered, trying to steady his grip on the leash. But Max whined again, a sound so foreign to the courtroom that even the stenographer's hands paused mid-typing. The little girl pressed against her mother, whispering, "Mommy, why won't Buddy come to me?" Her mother's throat tightened. She smoothed her daughter's hair, whispering back, "Because he's working, sweetheart." But her voice trembled, betraying her own doubt. The judge exhaled slowly, adjusting his glasses. His years on the bench had prepared him for complex legal arguments, dramatic revelations, even shocking confessions. But nothing had prepared him for a 3-year-old child identifying a police dog in the middle of a criminal trial. "Mr. Owens," the judge said firmly, "explain your dog's behavior." Owens swallowed hard. He was a man of discipline, not prone to dramatics, but even he felt the weight of what was unfolding. Your Honor, I can't explain it. Max has been trained for years to remain calm, focused. He doesn't react like this. He never has. Could this simply be a distraction? The prosecutor interjected quickly, trying to regain control of the narrative. Children often mistake one dog for another. German shepherds are a common breed. No. The little girl's voice rang out, higher and clearer than before. All heads turned back to her. She clutched the front of her dress, standing on the bench now, despite her mother's attempts to hold her down. Her tiny finger pointed directly at Max. That's Buddy. That's my dog. He knows me. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, and though her voice quivered, the conviction in her words silenced even the attorneys. Max barked once, sharp and loud, as though in answer. His tail wagged harder now, his entire body leaning forward. Owen struggled to hold him back, his boots skidding slightly on the polished floor. The defense attorney stood, voice rising. Your Honor, this is absurd. We cannot derail the trial for a child's fantasy. But even as he spoke, his words faltered under the undeniable reality before them. Everyone could see it. This was no fantasy. The mother finally rose to her feet, tears streaking her cheeks. She's not imagining it, she said, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry. That dog, we lost him years ago. He was taken from us during a burglary. My husband filed a report, but we never saw him again. My daughter may have been a baby, but she has grown up knowing his face, his name. And I know, that's our Buddy. Gasp ran through the gallery. The judge's face softened for a moment before he leaned forward again. Do you have proof of this claim? Mrs. Carter, she said, her voice cracking. Emily Carter. And proof? No, Your Honor. Only memories, photographs, stories, and a bond my daughter has never forgotten. Owens shifted uncomfortably. He wanted to defend the integrity of his canine partner, but even he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The way Max's ears twitched every time the girl spoke. The way his muscles tensed, as though straining to run to her. Dogs didn't lie, and Max wasn't lying now. The jury was no. Longer still. They whispered among themselves, their faces a mix of skepticism and sympathy. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Another man shook his head, as though trying to remind himself this was a legal proceeding, not a family drama. But the courtroom had shifted. This wasn't about legal tactics anymore. It was about truth. The judge rapped his gavel again. His voice firmer this time. Enough. We will restore order. But order was impossible. The air in the room was alive, every heart thudding with the same question. Could it really be true? Could this decorated police canine, the very symbol of justice, have once been a family dog torn from a child's arms? The defense attorney slammed his folder shut. Your Honor, I demand this distraction be struck from the record. It is irrelevant to the matter at hand. Objection sustained, the prosecutor added quickly, though her own voice lacked conviction. The judge studied Max for a long moment, then turned his gaze back to the Carters. His gavel lowered slowly to the desk. Irrelevant? He murmured almost to himself. We'll see. Emily Carter's daughter tugged at her sleeve again, whispering, Mommy, can I go to him? Please? Her mother shook her head, fresh, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not yet, baby. But Max had no patience for not yet. He let out another sharp bark, pulling so hard on his leash that Owen stumbled forward a step. The dog's eyes never wavered from the little girl's face. It was as though years of training had crumbled in an instant, replaced by something far stronger. Love? The jury's whispers rose again, louder now. They weren't just witnesses to a trial anymore. They were witnesses to a reunion. The judge lifted his gavel again, but instead of striking it, he set it down with a sigh. "This court will take a recess," he said, his voice rougher than before. The bailiff moved forward to restore order, but it was useless. People were already on their feet, murmuring, some even wiping at their eyes. The prosecutor sat heavily in her chair, her notes forgotten. The defense attorney muttered under his breath, his case slipping through his fingers in real time. And at the center of it all, a toddler pressed against her mother, whispering, "He remembers me." And anyone who looked at Max the way his body strained toward her, his eyes glistening with recognition, knew without a doubt. She was right. The courtroom, already thick with suspense, seemed to tremble under the weight of what had just unfolded. A toddler pointing at a decorated police canine and calling him "my dog" had shattered the sterile rhythm of a trial. For a moment, the usual order of gavel strikes and polished arguments dissolved, replaced by stunned silence and furtive whispers. Max, the German Shepherd K9, stood firmly at his handler's side. Normally, his presence commanded discipline, an aura of focus that reminded everyone of his years of service. But today was different. His entire demeanor had changed. His rigid posture softened, and the leash that usually needed no tension was now taut, straining toward the little girl. The handler, Officer Daniels, shifted uneasily. He had worked with Max for years. Together, they had tracked suspects, sniffed out drugs, and located missing persons. In courtrooms, Max had always sat like a statue, his training unshakable. But now Daniels could feel his partner trembling. Not from fear, but recognition. The toddler's mother, standing pale and trembling herself, had spoken of a burglary years earlier that led to their family dog's disappearance. She hadn't revealed every detail, but her words carried a pain that couldn't be faked. And the way Max responded? That spoke volumes. The judge, a man known for his stern demeanor, leaned forward. His glasses slid lower down his nose as he peered at Officer Daniels. "Officer," he said, his tone grave but tinged with curiosity. "It seems this child believes your canine is her lost dog. Do you have anything to say on the matter?" All eyes shifted to Daniels. He felt the weight of the entire courtroom pressing down on him. Lawyers, jurors, the grieving mother, the child with wide, tear-filled eyes, all waiting for his words. He cleared his throat, wishing he could retreat to the safety of a police cruiser. But there was no escaping this moment. "Your Honor," Daniels began, his voice steady but low. "Max was brought into the force about 4 years ago. He was found wandering the outskirts of the city. No identification tag. No collar. Thin, malnourished but sharp. The kind of sharp you don't often see in strays. The department saw his potential, so he was placed in training. He passed with flying colors. The rest is history." The courtroom absorbed his words in silence. Daniels continued, "I never questioned where he came from. Most dogs found like that don't have stories anyone ever uncovers." But he paused, glancing at Max, who now whimpered softly, eyes locked on the toddler. "I've never seen him react to anyone like this. Not once." Gasps filled the room. The defense attorney leapt to his feet, objecting furiously. Irrelevant. Completely irrelevant to the case at hand. He barked, his tie jerking with the force of his movement. "We're here to determine guilt or innocence, not play dog detective." But even as he spoke, his voice was drowned out by the murmurs rippling across the gallery. The story had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't about the trial anymore. It was about the undeniable connection between a child and a dog sworn to duty. The judge rapped his gavel sharply, though his eyes betrayed something softer. "Order. Order in the court. This trial will proceed, but I cannot ignore what has happened here." Officer Daniels, Do you suspect this canine once had an owner? Perhaps even this family? Daniels hesitated. A trained officer knew better than to speculate. But in that moment, he wasn't just an officer. He was a man standing between a loyal animal and the truth of its past. I don't just suspect it, he said quietly. I believe it's possible. The courtroom exploded again. Some clutched tissues. Others exchanged incredulous glances. The toddler reached out her small hands toward Max, calling softly, "Buddy, Buddy." Daniels froze. Buddy? That was the name she had used. And Max battle-hardened, disciplined Max jerked forward with such force that Daniels stumbled. The German shepherd let out a sharp bark, tail whipping like a flag in a storm, his eyes shining with recognition. The mother gasped, collapsing into tears. The jury stared, mouths agape. Even the defense attorney's protest faltered, his voice fading under the sheer force of the moment. The judge leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses and rubbing his temples. It was a courtroom. Yes, but it had also become something else entirely. The stage for a reunion no one had expected. Daniels knelt beside Max, looking into his partner's eyes. He saw something there, something he had never noticed before. It wasn't just obedience or loyalty forged by training. It was longing, memory, love. Slowly, Daniels lifted his head toward the judge. Your Honor, I think we need to find the truth. For this dog, for this family, for everyone here. The judge sighed, but there was a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Very well. This court will order steps to verify the claims. Until then, this canine will remain under temporary observation. The defense attorney slammed his files shut, muttering under his breath, but no one cared. The jury was transfixed. The gallery was openly crying, and at the center of it all was a toddler who had whispered two simple words that turned a trial upside down. My dog. But the story was not finished. Proof was still needed. And what came next would test loyalty, justice, and the bond between a child and her lost companion in ways no one had anticipated. The trial could wait. The truth demanded to be uncovered. The tension in the courtroom was still electric. People whispered in awe. Jurors wiped their eyes, and the judge tried to re-establish control. Yet the scene of the little girl calling the canine my dog hung in the air like a haunting melody. No one could ignore. The judge's gavel struck once, sharply. This court requires clarity. The child's statement and the officer's testimony suggest a significant matter beyond this trial. Mrs. Harper, his gaze fixed on the mother. You claim this canine belonged to your family. Please explain. Every head turned. Mrs. Harper's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the witness stand. Her eyes glistened, but her voice was steady, forged from years of silent grief. Your Honor, she began softly. 4 years ago, we had a dog, a German shepherd. His name was Buddy. He wasn't just a pet, he was family. The gallery quieted. Even the defense attorney leaned forward despite himself. Mrs. Harper inhaled shakily, her eyes dropping to her daughter, who sat clinging to her grandmother in the gallery. The toddler's small hands twisted nervously, her eyes never leaving. The dog she called Buddy. We adopted Buddy when he was a puppy. My late husband, her voice cracked, but she pressed on, was the one who insisted. Said our daughter deserved to grow up with protection and love. From the start, Buddy was different. He wasn't just loyal, he was watchful. If our baby so much as whimpered at night, he'd scratch at our door until we checked on her. He followed her everywhere, never rough, always gentle, like he knew she was his purpose. A soft murmur ran through the courtroom. Max Buddy stood stiff, ears tilted forward, as though listening intently. One night, she continued, swallowing hard, everything changed. My husband was working late. I was home alone with my daughter, who was barely 2 at the time. Around midnight, I heard glass shattering. A man had broken into our home. Before I could even scream, Buddy charged. Gasps filled the room. He fought that intruder with everything he had. Gave us enough time to run. I grabbed my daughter, ran out the back door, and screamed for help. Neighbors called the police. When officers arrived, the man was gone. And so was Buddy. Tears slid down her face, and she brushed them away quickly. I searched for him for months. I put up posters. I drove to shelters every week. I begged animal control for updates. Nothing. It was like he vanished. My daughter cried for him every night. She'd ask me, "Where's Buddy? When is he coming home?" And I had no answers. She paused, her hands trembling. I thought maybe he'd been killed that night. Or maybe someone took him. But deep down, I couldn't believe it. I prayed he was alive. I prayed he was safe. And today, when my little girl pointed at that dog, her voice broke, tears spilling freely now. For the first time in years, I feel like those prayers might have been answered. Silence engulfed the courtroom. Even the defense attorney lowered his head. Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He glanced at Max, whose chest heaved as he panted quietly. The German shepherd's gaze never left the child. He whined softly, as though remembering the nights he had once stood guard at her crib. The judge, visibly moved, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harper, do you have any proof of ownership? Photos? Records?" She nodded quickly, fumbling with her purse. "Yes, I never stopped carrying them, just in case." She pulled out a worn folder, edges frayed from years of handling. Inside were photographs. A little girl giggling in the grass, her arms around a German shepherd's neck. Another of the dog lying protectively at the foot of a toddler's bed. Gasps rippled again as the photos were passed around. The resemblance was undeniable. Same markings, same alert ears, same sharp, intelligent eyes. Officer Daniels leaned forward to look. His chest tightened. The dog in the photo was identical to Max, down to the small scar on his left flank, barely visible beneath his fur, a scar Daniels had always wondered about. The judge examined the images before lifting. His gaze. "Officer Daniels, does the department keep intake records of canine recruits?" Daniels nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Your Honor. Max was logged in the system when he was found. But I'll admit I never asked about his past. He came in as a stray. No collar, no chip." Mrs. Harper spoke quickly, desperation lacing her words. "He had a chip. We had him microchipped as a puppy. I still have the paperwork. If you scan him, you'll see." The courtroom buzzed again. The judge slammed his gavel. "Enough! Order!" He turned to Daniels. "Officer, I order an immediate scan of this dog. If he is chipped, we will know the truth." Daniels swallowed hard. His partner, his loyal companion, might not belong to him after all. But as he looked at Max, he saw something that made his chest ache. The dog was no longer focused on him. His eyes, once always trained on his handler, were now fixed entirely on the child in the gallery. The defense attorney finally stood, his voice sharp though less certain. "Your Honor, this is a criminal trial. This emotional diversion is irrelevant." The judge's glare silenced him instantly. "Justice, Counselor, is not irrelevant. Not to me, and not to this court." Mrs. Harper sat down, her chest heaving with sobs. Her daughter reached for her, whispering, "Mommy, can Buddy come home now?" The entire courtroom froze. People wept quietly. Even the court reporter dabbed her eyes. Max whimpered again, straining at his leash, every fiber of his being pulling toward the little girl who once called him family. The truth was close. And everyone knew that when the chip was scanned, the courtroom would no longer be a place for law alone. it would be a place where love and loyalty demanded to be heard. Atmosphere in the courtroom felt like the air before a storm charged, heavy, waiting to break. Everyone's eyes darted between the judge, the grieving mother, the little girl clutching her grandmother's hand, and the German shepherd who stood rigid, his leash taut in Officer Daniel's grip. The judge's voice boomed, cutting through the tension. "Bailiff, bring in a scanner immediately. This court will establish the truth without delay." The bailiff nodded briskly and hurried out, leaving a silence so deep the faint hum of the ceiling fan could be heard. People leaned forward, whispering nervously. Reporters scribbled notes as though capturing history in real time. Officer Daniels looked down at Mac's buddy as the child had called him. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Daniels felt his hand tremble against the leash. He had trained this dog, trusted him with his life, but now the possibility that Max had belonged to another family weighed heavily on his chest. Max's ears flicked, nose twitching. His eyes never left the little girl. Her small hand stretched toward him, just beyond reach. Every time she whispered "buddy," his tail wagged in short, hesitant bursts, as if torn between two worlds. Mrs. Harper clutched her folder of records like a lifeline. She whispered a prayer under her breath, her voice cracking. "Please, God, let it be him." The door creaked open. The bailiff returned, holding a handheld microchip scanner. All eyes followed the device, as though it were a holy relic. He approached the stand and placed it carefully in the judge's hands. The judge turned solemnly to Officer Daniels. "Bring the dog forward." Daniels hesitated. His throat tightened, and his fingers dug into the leash. He knew that once the truth came out, things might never be the same. Max could be taken from him. The thought felt like losing family. Yet, Daniels also knew justice meant uncovering the truth, even if it broke him. With a heavy heart, he led Max to the center of the courtroom. The German shepherd trotted obediently, his paws echoing on the wooden floor. The toddler in the gallery gasped softly, eyes wide, whispering again, "Buddy." The judge held the scanner, then passed it to the bailiff. "Proceed." The bailiff knelt, his hands steady, and placed the scanner near Max's shoulder blade. Usual spot where chips were implanted. A high-pitched beep pierced the silence. Everyone jumped. A number appeared on the screen. The bailiff's eyes widened. He quickly turned to the judge. "Your Honor." As a registered chip. A ripple of gasps filled the room. Mrs. Harper clutched her chest, tears spilling down her face. Her daughter squealed with delight, bouncing in her grandmother's lap. The judge's stern face softened only slightly. "Whose information is attached to it?" The bailiff connected the scanner to a small tablet. The system processed for what felt like an eternity. Then, in bold black letters, the name appeared. Harper. Daniel and Emily. Mrs. Harper sobbed, covering her mouth with her hands. Her knees buckled as she nearly collapsed back into her chair. The toddler wriggled free from her grandmother's arms and cried out, "Mommy, it is Buddy. I told you." The entire courtroom erupted in whispers, gasps. Even applause from some. Max Buddy began whining, pulling against the leash with desperate energy. His eyes locked on the child. His tail thrashed wildly. For the first time, he barked not the sharp bark of a trained police canine, but the joyful bark of a dog recognizing home. Officer Daniel's face crumbled. He tried to stay composed, but his vision blurred. His partner, his companion through raids, rescues, and dark nights, wasn't truly his. He belonged to someone else. To a child who had never stopped calling his name in the dark. The judge's gavel pounded repeatedly, calling the court back to order. Silence. This is still a trial, and the facts must be respected. His voice trembled slightly despite his effort to stay composed. He turned to Mrs. Harper. "Mrs. Harper, It appears your claims are supported by evidence. This canine was indeed once your family's pet. The defense attorney slammed his folder shut in frustration. Your Honor, this spectacle has derailed proceedings. Whether or not this dog belonged to her years ago has no relevance to the charges at hand. The judge's eyes narrowed dangerously. Do not lecture this court on relevance, counselor. The integrity of justice includes truth in all forms. And this, he gestured toward the weeping child and the straining dog, is a truth that cannot be ignored. Reporters' pens scratched frantically. Cameras flashed, and the gallery buzzed like a beehive. Mrs. Harper rose again, tears streaking her cheeks. Your Honor, please let him come home with us. He saved our lives once. He was stolen from us. My daughter needs him. I need him. Don't make us lose him twice. Max barked again, louder this time, pulling so hard the leash cut into Daniel's hand. The toddler squealed with joy, reaching for him. Buddy, come. Something inside. Daniel's broke. He looked down at Max, his partner, his best friend, and felt the ache of loss searing his chest. But when he looked up at the child, he saw something deeper, the reflection of a bond older than his. A bond forged before he ever met Max. Slowly, Officer Daniels crouched. He unhooked the leash. A collective gasp filled the room. Go, he whispered, his voice breaking. Max bolted, claws skittering on the floor. He charged toward the gallery and leapt straight into the little girl's arms. She squealed as he licked her face relentlessly, wagging his tail so hard it thudded against the wooden benches. Mrs. Harper buried her hands in his fur, sobbing uncontrollably. The entire courtroom dissolved into tears. Even the stenographer paused to wipe her eyes. The judge lowered his gavel, his own face lined with emotion. This court will recess for 1 hour. We have much to discuss. But no one heard him. Their eyes were locked on the sight in the gallery. A little girl clutching her lost protector, a mother reunited with hope, and a police officer who had just sacrificed a piece of his own heart for the sake of truth. Daniel sat back heavily. In his chair, his hands empty, his chest hollow. But in the midst of his grief, he allowed himself a small smile. For the first time, Max knew Buddy was truly home. Yet deep down, Daniels knew the fight wasn't over. The department wouldn't easily give up a trained canine. Legal questions would follow. Battles over ownership, service duty, and justice still lingered. But in that moment, as Buddy nuzzled his little girl's cheek, none of that mattered. Love had found its way home. And the courtroom would never forget the day a simple scan changed everything. The courthouse was bursting with people, the air thick with anticipation. What had begun as an ordinary trial had transformed into something no one could have predicted. A moment of truth about a police dog named Max, a toddler's whispered words, and a family's lost past. Reporters filled every bench, their cameras, waiting to capture the moment. Ordinary citizens who had read about the strange events of the trial days earlier squeezed into the back rows, clutching their phones to livestream what might unfold. Even lawyers and clerks from other courtrooms slipped quietly in, desperate not to miss history in the making. Got at the front. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his own nervous anticipation. Court is now in session, he announced firmly. Today, we will hear the results of the DNA analysis concerning the police dog, Max. The defendant sat stone-faced at his table, but sweat lined his forehead. Across from him, the prosecutor shuffled papers, though his eyes remained fixed on the family seated just behind the young mother, her little girl resting on her lap, and her trembling hands clasped tightly together. The clerk stepped forward, a sealed envelope in hand. The sound of it being torn open seemed to echo through the hushed courtroom. Everyone leaned forward, hearts pounding. The clerk unfolded the document, his voice deliberate and steady, but weighted with the knowledge that his words would change lives. After conducting genetic analysis, he read aloud the results. Confirmed that the police dog known as Max shares a genetic match with a sample provided by the Thompson family. The probability of relation is 99.9%. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, cries, and exclamations filled the air as the weight of those words sank in. The mother clapped her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The toddler let out a squeal of joy and squirmed from her mother's lap, pointing at Max. "My dog," she shouted, her voice bright and unshaken. Max, who had been sitting obediently beside his handler, suddenly let out a sharp bark, his tail whipping against the wooden floor. He strained at the leash, his ears perked, his eyes locked onto the little girl. His handler, Sergeant Lewis, tried to hold him back, but Max pulled with a strength fueled by recognition and longing. The judge lifted a hand, silencing the noise with surprising authority. "Order," he called out. "Order in the court." Yet even he could not fully conceal the smile tugging at his lips. For all his years on the bench, he had never presided over a case quite like this. Justice, it seemed, was taking on a form far greater than the trial itself. With a reluctant nod, Sergeant Lewis loosened his grip on the leash. "Go, Max," he whispered. The German shepherd bolted across the polished courtroom floor, paws skidding slightly as he ran straight to the little girl. She let out a laugh that sounded like music as Max leapt forward, licking her face and pressing his head against her tiny chest. The force of his joy nearly knocked her backward, but her mother's arms caught them both in a trembling embrace. Tears blurred the vision of nearly everyone watching. Jurors dabbed their eyes with tissues. Attorneys lowered their heads to hide the emotion they couldn't contain, and even the bailiff stone-faced and stoic wiped his cheek discreetly. The mother's sobs turned into laughter as she whispered the dog's old name, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Buddy, oh buddy, it really is you." At that sound, Max barked again, tail wagging furiously, as though confirming everything. The toddler clapped her hands and buried her face in his fur, repeating those two words again and again. "My dog, my dog." It was more than a reunion. It was a miracle that unfolded before everyone's eyes. Judge Harrison leaned forward, removing his glasses, his eyes shining with tears. "This court recognizes the profound significance of these findings," he said, his voice softer than usual. "This is not only a matter of evidence. It is a matter of truth, family, and justice." The defense attorney stood abruptly, trying to object, to redirect the case back to the original charges. But the attempt sounded hollow, even desperate. No one was listening. The prosecutor seized the moment. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "this discovery exposes cracks in the defendant's testimony. It proves that evidence was manipulated, that lives were disrupted by lies. This trial is no longer simply about guilt or innocence. It is about accountability." The defendant shifted uneasily, his jaw tightening. For the first time, the confidence he had worn like armor seemed to crumble. He looked at the dog, then at the little girl, and for a fleeting moment, guilt flickered in his eyes. The judge nodded. Gravely, "We will proceed with the case accordingly. But let us acknowledge what we have witnessed today. A child's voice, simple yet pure, has led us to the truth." The toddler, unaware of the legal weight her words had carried, continued to stroke Max's fur, giggling as he licked her hands. Her innocence had unveiled what investigation and paperwork could not: the unbreakable bond between a family and their lost companion. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. Television crews reported live updates, their voices trembling as they described the reunion that had brought an entire courtroom to tears. Social media exploded with clips of the little girl embracing Max, hashtags flooding timelines. Hashtag my dog, hashtag courtroom miracle, hashtag Max and the girl. Within hours, the story became national news. Headlines described it as the trial that turned into a reunion and the dog that found his family in court. Strangers across the country wept. Watching the footage, many sending messages of hope and love to the family. Back inside, the court adjourned temporarily, unable to proceed while emotions ran so high. Judge Harrison allowed the family a private moment with Max in his chambers, away from the chaos of cameras. There, the mother knelt on the floor, clutching Max's face between her hands, whispering promises she had longed to speak for years. "We thought you were gone forever, but you came back to us." The little girl leaned against Max, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck. Max stayed perfectly still, his chest rising and falling as though he too had finally found peace. Sergeant Lewis, standing nearby, swallowed hard. He had trained Max, served with him, trusted him in dangerous situations. Yet seeing this reunion, he knew where Max truly belonged. He stepped forward quietly and spoke to the mother. "He was always your dog," he admitted. "We just borrowed him for a while." The words struck her deeply, tears streaming down her cheeks once more. She whispered her gratitude, though no words seemed enough. That day, the courtroom had been filled with tears, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of healing, of family restored, of justice in its truest form. And as Max lay at the feet of the little girl, his tail thumping rhythmically against the floor, everyone knew that this was only the beginning of a story that would be remembered for years to come. The courthouse was packed to capacity, buzzing with an energy unlike anything it had seen before. News of the shocking DNA results that the police canine, Max, was indeed the missing family dog had spread across town like wildfire. By the time the session resumed, every seat in the gallery was filled, reporters lined the walls, and dozens of cameras waited outside. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a story of fate, justice, and reunion that had captured the hearts of an entire community. Inside, the atmosphere felt different from the tense, rigid silence that had dominated the earlier days of the trial. Today, there was a current of hope, an almost sacred stillness that seemed to vibrate in the air. At the center of it all sat the little girl, her tiny hand clasped in her mother's, her eyes wide as she looked toward Max. The German shepherd was calmer now, no longer straining against the leash like before. It was as if he knew that. He was finally recognized, finally found, finally home. The judge entered the room, his usually stern expression softened by the gravity of what had unfolded. Even he, a man hardened by decades of hearing tragic cases, appeared visibly moved. He banged his gavel, calling the court to order, but his voice carried warmth this time, instead of sharp authority. "Before we proceed with the final matters of this case," the judge began, "I would like to acknowledge the extraordinary events that have taken place in this courtroom. It is not often that justice reveals itself in such unexpected ways. Today, this court has not only pursued truth, it has witnessed a miracle." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and all eyes drifted once more to the little girl. She sat up straighter, sensing the weight of the moment, even in her innocence. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, fixed only on Max, who returned the look with loyal devotion. The prosecution rose first, their tone surprisingly gentle, after the days of cross-examinations and pointed arguments. "Your Honor," the attorney said, "this revelation has not only impacted the emotional core of this case, but has directly undermined the credibility of the defendant. The defendant's narrative was built on deception, and the uncovering of Max's true identity proves just how deep that deception ran." The defense attorney tried to mount a counter-argument, but his words faltered under the weight of the truth that no one could deny. Even he, visibly weary, seemed to accept that the trial had taken a turn no strategy could overcome. The jurors, once stoic, now carried expressions filled with sympathy and determination. They weren't just judging the evidence anymore. They were bearing witness to a story that would be remembered long after the verdict. Max let out a soft whine, breaking the silence, and the little girl giggled. It was such a small sound, yet in that solemn room, it felt like a bell ringing. The innocence of it, the purity of a child's laugh in the middle of a courtroom, cut through every hardened exterior. Even the bailiff, who had stood stone-faced for hours on end, cracked the faintest smile. The judge called for final statements. The prosecution delivered theirs with conviction, underscoring the lies of the defendant and the undeniable truth that had emerged. The defense stumbled through theirs, grasping for fragments of dignity. And then came the moment of deliberation. The jury left the room, and the waiting began. Every minute felt longer than the last, the air thick with anticipation. The mother stroked her daughter's hair, whispering reassurances, while Max rested obediently at their feet, though his eyes never left the little girl. For him, this wasn't about trials or verdicts. It was about finally being reunited with the family he had lost. When the jury returned, the silence was absolute. You could hear the faintest shuffle of feet, the rustle of papers, the trembling breath of those holding back tears. The four-person stood, holding the verdict slip, their hands steady but their eyes moist. On the charge of obstruction of justice, the four-person began, their voice echoing in the courtroom. We find the defendant guilty. On the charge of perjury, we find the defendant guilty. And on the charge central to this case, attempted burglary, we find the defendant guilty. The room erupted. Gasps, sighs of relief, and even soft applause broke through the formal decorum. The judge quickly called for order, but he didn't hide the small nod of satisfaction on his face. Justice had been served. Yet what happened next overshadowed even the verdict. The judge, after sentencing, paused before dismissing the court. His gaze fell upon Max, then upon the little girl. There remains one final matter, he said softly. Max has served this community with honor, bravery, and loyalty. But it is clear to me, and to everyone here, that his true home is with this family. Therefore, I am ordering his retirement from active duty, effective immediately. He will return to the family from which he was taken. For a moment, the room was silent, almost in disbelief. Then the little girl cried out, her small voice ringing with joy. My dog! Max barked, a deep, jubilant sound, before leaping forward. This time, no one held him back. He bounded across the floor and into the arms of the child, who wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. Tears streamed down her face, tears of pure happiness, as she buried her face in his fur. The mother sobbed openly, kneeling beside them, stroking Max's head as though trying to make up for all the years they had lost. The courtroom was no longer a place of judgment. It was a place of healing. Jurors wiped their eyes. Reporters lowered their cameras, unwilling to intrude on the sacredness of the moment. Even the defendant, now shackled and escorted away, paused to watch, his expression unreadable as the sound of joy echoed behind him. Outside, when the family finally stepped through the courthouse doors, they were greeted by a sea of flashing cameras and cheering citizens. People who had come expecting to witness a dry legal proceeding instead witnessed a reunion that reminded them of love, loyalty, and the miracles life sometimes holds. The little girl held Max's leash tightly, her face glowing as she paraded, her best friend proudly through the crowd. He came back, she whispered over and over, as if reassuring herself that this wasn't a dream. He came back. And Max, loyal as ever, never left her side. He walked tall, no longer just a police dog, No longer just a piece of evidence in a trial, but a hero, a protector, and most importantly, family. For years to come, people would tell the story of the little girl who pointed at a police dog in a crowded courtroom and whispered two simple words that changed everything. My dog. It was a story of justice, yes, but also of destiny, of how love has a way of finding its way back, no matter how much time or distance separates it. And in that small town, whenever someone doubted whether miracles still existed, they needed only to remember that day in the courtroom when everyone was in tears, not from sorrow, but from witnessing love reunite what was once lost.